How many times have you been blamed for a problem you didn't actually create? Think about the pattern. You apologize just to calm things down. You take responsibility to keep the relationship intact. You bend, adjust, and explain yourself. While she always seems to have a reason, a justification, a story that somehow turns her choices into your fault. And the more patient you are, the more this dynamic repeats. Here's what most men never stop to question. This isn't happening because you're weak, passive, or not enough. It's happening because you're operating inside a framework where accountability is rarely expected from women and heavily demanded from men. In that framework, kindness becomes a disadvantage, and honesty feels like a risk. So why do so many women resist accountability? And why are the most decent men often the ones who pay the highest price? I'm going to break this down with you from a perspective you don't usually hear. A woman who understands exactly how and why women avoid responsibility and how that avoidance gets reinforced. This isn't about attacking women or excusing men. It's about decoding behavior so you stop losing ground without even realizing it. Because if you don't understand this mechanism, you'll keep surrendering control in relationships that quietly drain you. If you want clarity instead of confusion, like this video and subscribe. Let's get into it. You've been told a story for a long time. A story that sounds good on the surface, but quietly sabotages relationships once you look closer. That story says empowerment means never feeling uncomfortable, never being questioned, never having to sit with the consequences of your own choices. But real empowerment has never worked that way. True empowerment is the ability to say, "This was my decision, and I own what came from it." Fake empowerment is being protected from outcomes while still enjoying the benefits of choice. And once you understand that distinction, a lot of confusing behavior suddenly makes sense. This is why accountability triggers such a strong emotional reaction in many women. The moment responsibility is requested, it feels like a threat. Not because the request is unreasonable, but because it clashes with the version of empowerment they've been conditioned to expect. When accountability enters the room, the illusion cracks. You've probably experienced this firsthand. You calmly point out something that hurt you. You're not attacking. You're not raising your voice. You're simply naming what happened. And suddenly, the conversation flips. Now you're too sensitive. Now you're starting a fight. Now your boundaries are framed as aggression. What changed wasn't your tone. What changed was the power dynamic. When someone has grown accustomed to being shielded from consequences, accountability feels like punishment, even when it's delivered with respect. That's why reasonable feedback gets rebranded as control. That's why responsibility gets mislabeled as hostility. And here's the part most men miss. This isn't about cruelty or malice. It's about conditioning. If a system repeatedly rewards avoidance and rescues people from outcomes, it trains them to see responsibility as an injustice rather than a requirement. That's why the phrase, "I'm holding you accountable," can land harder than an insult. It threatens a structure where emotional comfort has been prioritized over personal responsibility for years. Remember this line, because it explains more than you think. The moment accountability feels like oppression, power has already corrupted character. Once you see that, you stop taking these reactions personally. And more importantly, you stop negotiating with a reality that was never built to be fair to you in the first place. To understand why accountability feels so foreign to many women, you have to look far earlier than dating, relationships, or adulthood. You have to look at how behavior is shaped long before attraction ever enters the picture. Watch how society reacts when a young boy makes a mistake. The response is usually direct. He's told what he did wrong. He's expected to correct it. There's an unspoken lesson baked into that moment. Actions have consequences, and responsibility is part of growing up. Now compare that to how a young girl is often treated in the same situation. The tone changes. The explanation gets longer. The punishment gets softer. Intentions are emphasized over outcomes. Feelings are protected before behavior is corrected. Over time, this creates a very different internal wiring. This isn't about favoritism, it's about conditioning. When leniency becomes the default response, it quietly teaches entitlement. When consequences are softened or redirected, it teaches avoidance. And when accountability is delayed or outsourced, it teaches a subtle but powerful lesson. Discomfort is something to be escaped, not processed. Psychologically, this is learned behavior. The mind adapts to what works. If deflection, emotional distress, or shifting the narrative consistently reduces pressure, those strategies get reinforced. They don't feel manipulative to the person using them. They feel normal, protective, even justified. Fast forward into adulthood, and you see the pattern play out in relationships. Apologies are avoided, not because the mistake wasn't real, but because admitting fault feels unfamiliar. Conversations drift away from the original issue and toward tone, intent, or how hurt she feels. Responsibility doesn't disappear. It just gets reframed. You might notice how quickly the story changes. What began as a simple discussion about behavior turns into a conversation about her emotions, then her past, then her stress. And suddenly, the original point is gone. Not denied, just buried. This is why so many men feel confused. They sense something is off, but they can't quite name it. They're not dealing with malice. They're dealing with a system that trained someone to prioritize emotional relief over ownership. And this distinction matters, because once you see that this isn't about female nature, but about long-term reinforcement, you stop arguing facts. You stop explaining yourself into exhaustion. You realize you're not debating logic. You're colliding with conditioning. And conditioning doesn't change through persuasion. It only changes when accountability becomes unavoidable. Modern dating didn't just change how people meet. It quietly changed how responsibility works inside relationships. When options are limited, people are forced to repair what they have. When options are endless, walking away becomes easier than reflecting. And today, many women live in an environment where replacement is not a fear, it's a convenience. Think about what constant access to attention does to accountability. When validation is always available, mistakes don't feel costly. When there's always another option waiting, fixing things feels optional. Responsibility becomes heavy, unnecessary weight in a world designed to offer emotional escape routes. This is why many women don't fear losing a good man, not because they don't value him, but because abundance dulls urgency. If something feels uncomfortable, there's a quiet voice whispering, "You don't have to deal with this, you can do better." Dating apps amplify this mindset. Every swipe reinforces the idea that dissatisfaction doesn't require effort, it requires movement. Instead of asking, "What did I contribute to this?" the question becomes, "Why should I settle?" Accountability starts to feel like settling for discomfort rather than an investment in growth. You see this most clearly when a relationship hits friction. Communication breaks down. Expectations clash. Boundaries surface. And instead of slowing down and repairing, the narrative shifts. Maybe we're just not compatible. Maybe I deserve someone who understands me. Those statements sound mature, but often they mask avoidance. Because compatibility isn't tested when everything is easy. It's revealed when responsibility is required. In an environment of endless choice, self-correction feels unnecessary. Why look inward when outward options are limitless? Why take ownership when you can simply reset the game? Over time, this trains people to associate accountability with loss rather than strength. And here's the consequence most men don't anticipate. When accountability disappears, so does respect. Not immediately, quietly, subtly. The man who tolerates deflection becomes predictable. The man who absorbs blame becomes safe, but not valued. There's a line worth remembering here. Accountability dies in a world where replacement is always one swipe away. Until that dynamic changes, many women will continue to see responsibility as something optional, something only demanded when there are no better alternatives waiting in the background. At this point, a pattern should be coming into focus. Not a judgment, not an accusation, a pattern. And patterns matter because they repeat, even when people refuse to name them. This is where many men get stuck. They sense something is wrong, but they keep treating each incident as isolated. It's not. What you're dealing with follows a recognizable structure, especially in women who have learned that accountability is optional. Let's break it down clearly. The first pattern is attention over integrity. These women are deeply invested in being seen, admired, and emotionally validated. The problem isn't wanting attention, it's what they're willing to sacrifice to keep it. When mistakes happen, accountability threatens their image. So instead of addressing the issue openly, they manage perception. Apologies, if they happen, are private and carefully worded. Public ownership is avoided. And when criticism appears, the focus shifts, not to the behavior, but to how unfair, harsh, or misunderstood they feel. The goal isn't resolution, it's spotlight control. The second pattern is relationship sabotage. You'll notice a strong pull toward men who are unavailable, already committed, or emotionally distant. Why? Because these situations offer high validation with low responsibility. There are fewer expectations, fewer consequences. And when things go wrong, the explanation is simple. It just happened. No one is fully accountable because no one was ever fully committed. These dynamics feel exciting, but they're also safe from real self-examination. There's no need to ask hard questions when the situation itself absorbs the blame. And when the fallout comes, responsibility gets diluted across circumstance, timing, or fate. The third, and most destructive pattern, is victimhood as leverage. This is where accountability completely collapses. When consequences approach, emotion becomes a shield. Tears replace reflection. Overwhelm replaces ownership. The narrative shifts from what I did to how this is affecting me. The focus moves away from behavior and on to suffering. And here's the key detail. This isn't always calculated. It's often automatic. When distress has historically reduced pressure, the nervous system learns to deploy it. The result is a dynamic where the man feels cruel for even raising the issue. He starts comforting the very person who avoided responsibility in the first place. Notice what never gets answered in this pattern. One simple question: what was my part in this? That question is avoided because it leads directly to accountability, and accountability threatens the structure that's been protecting them for years. Now, it's critical to say this clearly. Not all women operate this way. Many are capable of deep self-reflection, ownership, and growth. But men get into trouble when they ignore patterns out of hope, attraction, or fear of conflict. Because patterns don't disappear when you stop naming them. They intensify. Respect doesn't come from tolerance, it comes from clarity. If you keep engaging someone who consistently avoids responsibility, you're not being patient, you're teaching them what they can get away with. And the longer that lesson is reinforced, the harder it becomes to reverse. Seeing the pattern doesn't make you cynical, it makes you prepared. What makes this dynamic so powerful isn't just individual behavior. It's the environment that rewards it. Look at how society responds the moment a woman is questioned. The tone shifts instantly. The assumption flips. Scrutiny is replaced with protection. Meanwhile, when a man sets a boundary or asks for accountability, his motives are interrogated before the facts ever are. He's told to be more understanding, more patient, more careful with her feelings. This asymmetry doesn't happen by accident. Over time, many women learn something crucial. If conflict escalates, the odds are in their favor. Emotional expression is validated. Distress is amplified. And belief is often granted before responsibility is examined. That knowledge shapes behavior, even subconsciously. This is why accountability feels optional in so many situations. When consequences approach, there's an unspoken safety net waiting. Friends, social narratives, and cultural messaging all reinforce the same idea. Discomfort means something wrong is being done to her, not something she may need to reflect on. Now consider what this does to men. Men learn quickly that pushing back carries a cost. Speak up, and you risk being labeled insensitive. Set a boundary, and you're told you're escalating. Hold firm, and suddenly you're the problem. So many men choose the path of least resistance. They go quiet. They soften. They absorb blame that doesn't belong to them, not because they agree, but because they're exhausted. This creates a dangerous loop. Women who avoid accountability feel increasingly justified. Men who demand it feel increasingly isolated. Over time, responsibility disappears from the relationship altogether. What remains is emotional imbalance, one side protected, the other perpetually adjusting. And here's the truth most people don't want to confront. Removing accountability doesn't create safety. It creates power without restraint. When someone is consistently shielded from consequences, the behavior doesn't improve. It escalates. This is where manipulation quietly takes root, not through malice, but through reinforcement. When victimhood reliably produces relief, it becomes a strategy. When society applauds it, it becomes normalized. Remember this clearly. A system that removes accountability doesn't create safety. It creates abuse. Not always loud, not always obvious, but slow, corrosive, and deeply destabilizing, especially for the men who keep telling themselves that staying silent is the mature choice. It isn't. Silence doesn't restore balance. It teaches people how far they can go. Now comes the part most men instinctively resist. Not because it's untrue, but because it's uncomfortable. For all the social conditioning, the reinforcement, the cultural blind spots, none of this works without participation. And in many cases, the participation comes from men who believe they're being loving, patient, or emotionally mature. A lot of men are afraid of one specific label. They don't want to be seen as controlling. They don't want to be that guy. And underneath that fear is something even more personal, the fear of losing her. So instead of standing firm, they soften. They rationalize. They tell themselves it's not worth the conflict. This is how accountability quietly disappears. You apologize to move things along, even when you weren't wrong. You overlook patterns because calling them out feels harsh. You notice red flags, but you explain them away because she had a bad day, a hard past, or a valid reason. And every time you do this, you teach a lesson, just not the one you think you're teaching. You're not teaching compassion. You're teaching tolerance without consequence. There's a moment many men will recognize. She crosses a line. You feel it in your body. Something tightens. But instead of addressing it directly, you say, "It's okay, I get it." Even though you don't. Even though it's still sitting there, unresolved. That moment matters more than you realize. Because from that point forward, accountability isn't missing. It's been replaced. Replaced by emotional management. Replaced by avoidance. Replaced by you doing the work that isn't yours to do. And here's the hard truth. Accountability cannot exist where consequences don't. If there is no cost to deflection, deflection becomes the strategy. Not because she's malicious, but because the environment rewards it. This doesn't mean becoming cold. It doesn't mean escalating conflict. It means recognizing that silence isn't neutral. Silence is instructive. It tells people what behavior is acceptable and what isn't. When men stop asking for accountability out of fear, they don't preserve the relationship. they hollow it out. Respect erodes, attraction fades, and resentment quietly takes its place. Accountability doesn't disappear on its own. It disappears when it's no longer required. And the moment you understand that, you stop asking why things feel one-sided and start seeing exactly how they became that way. Once you understand the dynamics, the question changes. It's no longer why accountability is avoided. It becomes how you reintroduce it, without anger, without lectures, and without losing yourself in the process. This isn't about dominance. It's about structure. Accountability only works when three elements are present. Miss one, and the whole thing collapses. The first is timing. Most men wait too long. They let irritation build. They replay the moment in their head. And when they finally speak up, it comes out charged. By then, the conversation is no longer about behavior. It's about emotion. Accountability gets lost in the noise. You address issues when they happen. Calmly, clearly. Not as a threat, not as an ultimatum, but as a statement of reality. Delayed accountability feels negotiable. Immediate accountability feels normal. The second element is boundaries. Not rules, not control. Boundaries. A boundary is simply you being clear about what you accept and what you don't. No speeches, no moral arguments, just clarity. When boundaries are vague, deflection thrives. When boundaries are specific, behavior has something to measure itself against. If you can't articulate what crosses the line, don't expect anyone else to respect it. The third, and most ignored element, is consequences. This is where most men fail, even when they get everything else right. They communicate, they explain, they set boundaries. But when those boundaries are crossed, nothing changes. Consequences aren't punishments, they're outcomes. They're what happens when behavior doesn't align with standards. And they only work when they're enforced without drama. No threats, no repeating yourself, just action. Here's the rule that ties all of this together. Stay emotionally regulated. The moment you argue feelings, you lose the frame. You don't need her to agree with you. You don't need her to feel good about it. You only need to be consistent. And never apologize for having standards. Apologize when you're wrong, never when you're clear. When accountability is introduced this way, something interesting happens. Women who respect themselves rise to meet it. They may not like it at first, but they adapt. Women who rely on avoidance don't. They push back, test limits, or leave. Both outcomes are information. Both outcomes protect you. Holding someone accountable doesn't mean forcing them to change. It means creating an environment where only healthy behavior survives. And once you do that, you stop chasing respect. You become the standard. If there's one thing you need to take away from this, it's this. Accountability doesn't destroy relationships. It destroys illusions. Illusions that love means tolerance without limits. Illusions that being patient means accepting disrespect. Illusions that staying silent somehow makes things better. Real connection, healthy connection, only exists where responsibility is shared. When one person is always protected from consequences and the other is always expected to absorb them, what you don't have is love. You have imbalance. A woman who respects herself can handle accountability. She may not enjoy it, but she understands it. She knows that ownership is part of adulthood, not an attack on her worth. A woman who can't handle accountability will resent you for asking, not because you're wrong, but because you've disrupted a system that benefited her. And that distinction matters. You don't need to argue. You don't need to convince. You don't need to chase understanding. You choose. You observe. You enforce your standards calmly and consistently. And then you let behavior reveal the truth faster than words ever could. This isn't about fixing women. It's about fixing the position you place yourself in. When you stop negotiating your boundaries, the right people adjust and the wrong ones remove themselves. Both outcomes are wins. So if this resonated, if you've recognized moments where you tolerated what you shouldn't have, take ownership of that. Not with shame, but with clarity. Subscribe to this channel if you want more conversations like this. Like the video if you're done being confused about why things feel one-sided. And leave a comment answering one simple question. Where have you tolerated what you shouldn't have? Share this with a man who's losing himself trying to keep the peace. Sometimes the most empowering thing you can do is stop excusing what costs you your self-respect.